I was at a dinner party recently, caught in the middle of a pretty spirited debate between a friend from Tehran and another from Madrid. They were arguing about history, specifically whose culture had the deeper, more influential roots. The Iranian friend was so passionate, almost shouting as he talked about the grandeur of the Persian Empire, while the Spanish friend, he just kept countering with the massive legacy of Rome and the Latin world. And they were drawing these hard lines in the sand, acting like their civilizations were completely alien to one another, like two distinct worlds that just happened to collide at this table. But as I sat there sipping my drink, just listening to the rhythm of their speech, the irony became almost overwhelming. They were trying so hard to prove how different they were, yet every time they reached for a fundamental concept to make their words for father, name, or God, they were unknowingly using the exact same root sounds. It was a bizarre experience, watching two people convinced they were historical opponents while their own tongues were betraying them, revealing this shared DNA they didn't even know existed. It made me realize that we often look at languages like English, Hindi, Spanish, or Persian as separate islands, defined by their differences. But if you stop looking at the map and start acting like a detective, you find out they aren't strangers at all. They are actually just one single ancient voice that decided to go on a 6,000-year road trip. That ancient voice is, of course, Proto-Indo-European, or PIE as it's usually called. And our mission today is to act as historical detectives and try to solve what is arguably one of the greatest linguistic puzzles of all time, uncovering the precise origin, the homeland of the community that spoke this ancestor language, connecting billions of people today.
It's a spectacular challenge. I mean, we are talking about a language that was never written down. It just vanished, before the start of recorded history in much of Europe. So to reconstruct the time and place of PIE, we have to integrate these highly specialized streams of evidence that, well, they rarely intersect so intensely.
What kind of streams are we talking about?
You need the granular detail of comparative linguistics to rebuild the language itself. Then you need chronological markers, things based on technological leaps that you can see in the vocabulary.
Okay, so words for new inventions.
Exactly. And you need hard data from archaeology. And now the newest computational models in genetics to act as critical checks on all the historical theories.
It sounds like a true cold case spanning 3 continents. Every single piece of evidence, whether it's a reconstructed word for axle or a unique burial custom or some strange phonetic shift, it all has to align across millennia in geography.
It does.
So before we can even begin to place PIE on a map, we need to understand the fundamental toolkit. How exactly do you reconstruct a language that nobody has spoken for thousands of years?
Well, the whole process relies on something we call the Comparative Method. It's a very systematic, highly formalized technique for studying how languages develop. What we do is take 2 or more languages, the so-called daughter languages like Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, or the ancient roots of Germanic, that we know share a common ancestor.
Right.
And we compare them feature by feature, sound by sound, to sort of extrapolate backward to infer the properties of that lost shared ancestor, which in this case is PIE.
Okay, so if you were comparing, say, Spanish, French, and Italian, you'd compare their versions of a word like head, trace them back to Vulgar Latin, and figure out the regular sound shifts that happen.
That's the idea.
But for PIE, the original language is completely hypothetical. It's a ghost. So how do you make sure your reconstruction is actually accurate and not just creative guesswork?
The accuracy really relies on one core principle, and it's something that is often misunderstood. It isn't based on just phonetic similarity.
So not just words that sound alike.
No, that's the beginner's mistake. You have to establish what are called regular sound correspondences.
Okay, break that down for me.
It means you have to demonstrate that the relationship between sounds is systematic across a whole bunch of words, not just a one-off coincidence.
Let's nail that down with a famous example. I know the Germanic languages are a great case study for this.
They are. The best example probably relates to the work of people like Jacob Grimm of fairy tale fame.
Grimm brothers.
Exactly. He established that when you compare Germanic languages, like early English, with other Indo-European branches, like Latin or Greek, you find this very regular pattern of sound shifts. For instance, where Italic languages like Latin have an initial D sound, the Germanic cognates, the related words, regularly show an initial T instead.
Okay, can you give us those specific pairs just to show how regular it is?
Sure. Look at the number 10. In Latin, you have decim.
With a D.
Right. In Germanic, you get 10 with a T. Or look at the number 2. Latin has duo.
Germanic has 2.
The pattern holds for nouns and verbs too. Latin dent, which gives us dental.
Corresponds to Germanic tooth.
And Latin domus, meaning house or home, relates to Germanic timber. This dentity shift is what we call the first sound shift, or Grimm's law.
And because it's so systematic, across hundreds of words, we know these languages have to come from a common ancestor that underwent this really precise rule-governed split.
That's it. You've got it.
And that core idea that sound changes are systematic, that was radical when it first came out, wasn't it? It was sort of the foundation of the neo-grammarian movement in the 19th century.
Oh, it was revolutionary. It completely transformed linguistics from, a sort of philology into a true science. The neo-grammarians established the foundational assumption for all modern comparative work,
Which is?
Sound laws have no exceptions.
No exceptions at all. That sounds...
It's a methodological principle, but it's a powerful one. It means that sound change proceeds mechanically, independent of a word's meaning or its grammar. Now, we do acknowledge that sporadic changes happen, things like analogy or borrowing.
Right.
But the general pattern of sound change is utterly regular. And this really disciplined approach is what allows linguists to produce a reconstructed PIE lexicon and grammar that is remarkably coherent.
So the outcome then isn't just some theoretical construct. It's a strong approximation of a language that was actually spoken by a real community of people.
Precisely. We infer that based on something called the uniformitarian principle in linguistics,
Which basically says?
that past languages should fall within the observed range of modern native languages. And since the PIE reconstruction reveals a highly coherent, complex human language, it has specific verbal aspects, an elaborate case system, complex roots, we infer that it has to correspond to a real speech community that existed in time and space.
Okay, so once we have this reconstructed language, the next job is to build the family tree, the subgrouping, to figure out the order in which the Indo-European family branched out. And this is where things get notoriously difficult, right? Because deciding which groups split off first seems to be a huge internal debate.
It is the ultimate challenge. The method requires us to look for what we call shared linguistic innovations.
So new features that pop up.
Exactly. Features that changed from the parent language, PIE, and are shared only by a specific subgroup. For example, if two branches, let's call them A and B, both share a unique new phonetic change that branch C does not, then we can say A and B are closer relatives.
And what about shared retentions? Things that stayed the same from PIE.
They tell you nothing about subgrouping.
Why not?
Because retaining an old feature from PIE just means you stayed true to the ancestor. It doesn't mean you're closely related to everyone else who also happened to keep it.
That makes sense.
The difficulty comes when researchers disagree on which innovations are more reliable for building that family tree. Is it the core vocabulary, the lexicon, or is the fundamental grammatical structure, the morphology and phonology, the rules of the language?
So words versus rules. Why are some researchers wary of using just words?
Well, because words can be borrowed easily.
Right.
If you look at computational methods, which we'll get into later, some of the early attempts to support one hypothesis over another heavily weighted morphological features, the structural rules. The argument was that these rules are much less likely to be borrowed than individual words.
They felt that morphology was like the genetic bedrock of the language.
That's a good way to put it. The structural rules, the how language functions, are seen as the deep, fundamental fingerprint of inheritance.
But you said there was a flaw in that thinking, too.
Yes. Other researchers argue that morphology and phonology can sometimes be too easily shared through contact.
Because the languages are neighbors.
Exactly. Geographical proximity can lead to languages converging, adopting the same sounds or grammatical patterns, even if they aren't genetically close. We call this phenomenon areal diffusion.
Areal diffusion, or a Sprachbund. Can you give us a concrete example of how that messes up a clean genetic tree model?
Absolutely. Think of the Balkans. Bulgarian, Romanian, Albanian, and Greek are genetically distinct languages.
Right, they belong to different major branches of Indo-European: Slavic, Romance, Hellenic, and Albanian.
Yet, because of millennia of geographical contact, they all share certain grammatical features. Like, for instance, the postpositioning of the definite article. It's like attaching the word the to the end of a noun instead of the beginning.
Which is not typical for their parent branches.
Not at all. So if you only looked at that shared morphological innovation, you would incorrectly group them together as being closer relatives than they actually are. That's the wave model effect, where features spread across a geographic space like ripples in a pond, regardless of ancestry, and it confuses the neat tree model.
That makes the work of a linguistic detective incredibly complicated. What other kinds of complications are there that interrupt this clean tree model?
Well, aside from widespread borrowing like English, taking the word taboo from Tongan and aerial diffusion, we also have to deal with irregular changes.
Things that don't follow the no exceptions rule.
Precisely. Sporadic changes. For instance, there's metathesis, where sounds randomly swap places in a word.
Oh, like in English when people say axe instead of ask.
Sort of, but historically ingrained. We
Okay.
see it in Spanish palabra, which comes from Latin parabola. The R and the al just switched places over time.
Okay.
Or there's analogy, where one word changes its form to match another, more common word. You see this in the Russian word for 9, devot. It changed its initial sound to match the word for 10, dosat.
Just to sound more like it.
Just to fit the pattern. So these sporadic, unsystematic changes have to be identified and accounted for one by one, and that adds a lot of complexity and uncertainty, especially to the deepest layers of the reconstruction.
So we've reconstructed this ghost language, and we know its internal splits are really tricky to sequence perfectly because of all this borrowing and contact. Now we get to the great geographical and chronological mystery, putting PIE on the map.
This is it. The search for the PIE homeland has dominated research for 2 centuries, and the debate really centers on 2 radically different theories. They differ on time, place, and the social engine that drove the dispersal of these languages.
And the consensus today heavily favors one of them.
It does. It favors the Kurgan or steppe hypothesis, but for decades it was a genuine hard-fought conflict.
Okay, let's start with the current frontrunner, the Kurgan hypothesis. Where does it place the origin, and when was PIE spoken?
This model places the PIE homeland squarely in the Pontic-Caspian Steppes. That's modern Ukraine and southern Russia.
And the timeline.
The theory suggests that the PIE language community existed there between roughly 4500 and 2500 BCE. And the society we can reconstruct from the vocabulary is critical here.
They were mobile pastoralists, right? Often identified with the Yamnaya culture.
Yes, and their lifestyle completely defined their lexicon. The reconstructed vocabulary is full of words related to a nomadic pastoralist existence.
Like what?
Terms for wool, for livestock like cattle and sheep, dairy foods, and a very specialized vocabulary surrounding the horse for transport and probably warfare.
And the dispersal model isn't about farming spreading slowly. It's about migration.
It's about migration, mobile groups moving out of the steppes and imposing their language on settled populations they encountered.
What I find so elegant about the Kurgan model is how well it seems to integrate the linguistic splits with actual archaeological evidence of migrations. Let's get into the details of that chronological fit.
Okay, we can trace the 3 earliest splits in the Indo-European family tree and match them almost perfectly to documented archaeological movements out of the steppe. The first split is the Anatolian branch. This includes languages like Hittite. They separated earliest, representing a kind of early PIE phase.
And their movement.
Their migration west into southeastern Europe aligns remarkably well with what's called the Suvarovo migration, which is dated to about 4200, 4000 BCE. This was the first major archaeologically visible movement out of the steppes.
So their early separation explains why Anatolian languages often lack a lot of the later features that characterize the rest of the Indo-European family.
Exactly. They left before those new features, those innovations, occurred. The next branch to split off was Tochurian.
Which was found much, much later in Western China.
Right. This post-Anatolian PIE group moved east, and that correlates with the Afanasevo migration into the western Altai Mountains, which started around 3300 BCE.
And finally, you get the huge cluster of European languages. Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian. They all split off later.
Yes, these late PIE branches dispersed westward later, and this correlates perfectly with the massive expansion of the Yamnaya culture.
And that involved movement up the Danube and into the Carpathian Basin.
Dated roughly 3100 to 2800 BCE. So you see, the Kurgan model just satisfies the chronological and directional requirements of the linguistic splits better than any other theory.
Okay, now for the primary competitor for all those years, the Anatolian Hypothesis. This theory pushes the timeline way, way back.
It does. The Anatolian Hypothesis, which was championed by the archaeologist Colin Renfrew, links PIE dispersal to the spread of farming. It argues the language originated much earlier, in Neolithic Anatolia, modern Turkey, somewhere between 7000 and 6500 BCE.
And the dispersal mechanism was totally different.
Completely. Not migration of people, but the peaceful, slow spread of agriculture, what he called the wave of advance, as farmers gradually expanded across Europe from Asia Minor.
This theory got a huge boost, not from linguistics directly, but from the early use of computational methods back in the 2000s.
That's right. Starting with a paper by Gray and Atkinson in 2003, and then later Buchart and others in 2012, researchers started applying Bayesian phylogenetic analysis. It's a set of statistical models drawn from epidemiology. They model the spatial diffusion and decay rate of things like viruses, or in this case words, to try and determine the age of language families.
Yeah, what did they find?
Their initial results suggested a divergence time for Indo-European of somewhere between 7,800 and 9,800 years ago, and that seemed to align perfectly with the Neolithic farming expansion.
So the math seemed to support the really early date. But this methodology faced some heavy criticism for its underlying assumptions, didn't it?
Massive criticism. The core problem, as critics like David Anthony pointed out, is that these models often rely on a constant rate of word replacement, a concept known as glotter chronology, and they tend to inherently bias toward older dates.
Why is that?
Because they assume that if two languages share a word, it's because they inherited it from the ancestor. They don't adequately account for the real-world complexity of language contact and borrowing.
So if I'm understanding this, the models basically assume that language decay happens at a steady, clock-like pace, and they completely ignore things like borrowing or the wave effects we just talked about.
Exactly. If you assume a constant clock and you ignore the effects of borrowing or the convergence caused by areal diffusion, then the time needed for the observed differences to evolve must be greater. It pushes the origin date further and further back.
It's a built-in bias.
Anthony famously called it retrofitting evidence to a model. He argued that the models were forcing complex linguistic history into this overly simplistic statistical framework that just didn't match the known archaeological or linguistic complexity.
And subsequent studies have been all over the place.
They have. Some computational studies still find the early date, while others, like one by Cheng and his colleagues in 2015, came out strongly in support of the much later Kurgan date.
Which brings us to the moment where the entire debate really hinges. The hard chronological evidence that can override these statistical models.
This is the definitive knockout blow against that early Anatolian date. The central chronological objection is that the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary contains words for Bronze Age technology that simply did not exist anywhere, not in Anatolia, not in Europe around 7000 BCE.
So PIE has a linguistic timestamp embedded right there in its vocabulary.
It absolutely does. When we reconstruct the lexicon of PIE proper, that is, the ancestor of all the branches except Anatolian, it paints a picture of a culture that was using the plow, that had metalworking terms, that had domesticated horses, and most crucially, wheeled vehicles.
And based on that technology, the date has to be much later.
Yes. Most estimates, based purely on this technology, place PIE somewhere between 4500 and 2500 BCE.
The wheel really acts as the ultimate archaeological synchronism. Where does the invention of the wheel actually fall on the timeline?
The invention of the wheel and axle principle, the thing that enabled true wagons and carts, is securely dated in the archaeological record to between 4000 and 3400 BCE. It seems to have originated in the Pontic-Caspian Steppes in Mesopotamia.
So if PIE was spoken in 7000 BCE, it would predate the wheel by thousands of years.
Right. Yet keywords for the parts of a wagon are reconstructible for late PIE, the common ancestor of all the major European and Asian branches.
Okay, what are the specific reconstructed words that tie PIE to this technology? Let's get into the weeds here.
We can reconstruct at least 5 critical terms, all with related words, cognates, across the major daughter languages, Italic, Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian, and so on. We have horos for axle, ukit for yoke, retis for wagon or chariot, and 2 distinct roots for wheel, including the general root and a very highly specialized derivative, kʷekʷlos.
So the backers of the Anatolian Hypothesis, they had to address this huge chronological gap. They tried to propose a couple of scenarios to explain why a 7000 BCE language would have 4000 BCE technology words. Let's look at the first one, independent coining.
Right. The independent coining argument suggests that the daughter languages, after they had already split up and separated, all independently chose the exact same 5 PIE roots to name the exact same 5 new vehicle parts when the wheel was finally invented, maybe 3,000 years later.
That seems like a statistical nightmare. Why is that considered so improbable?
It's not just improbable, it's linguistically impossible. Words are arbitrary signs. For 5 different concepts, wheel, axle, yoke, and so on, to be named using the same ancestral roots by separate, distant language communities is already an incredible coincidence. But the root kʷekʷlos, the primary word for wheel, that seals the argument.
Okay, so what makes kilo so unique?
It's formed from the PIE verbal root kilo, which means to turn or revolve. But the noun that comes from it, kʷekʷlos, has this highly specific, complex, and unusual morphological structure. It involves three features: reduplication, a zero-grade root, and a thematic vowel.
Okay, you're going to have to unpack that jargon for us. What do you mean by reduplication and zero grade?
Sure. Reduplication is basically repeating a part of the root, often the initial consonant. Think of ping pong instead of just pong. It signals a specific type of meaning, often an iterative action.
Okay. And zero grade?
Zero grade refers to the vowel gradation system of PIE, where the internal vowel of the root disappears or gets reduced in certain forms. In the case of kʷekʷlos, the root kвэл is used in its zero-grade form, klb, and then it's reduplicated, and a vowel is inserted to create kʷekws.
So this isn't just taking the verb to turn and making it a noun. It's using a very specific, rare, and structurally complex method to transform that verb.
Exactly. It's like finding a custom-made lock and then suggesting that 30 different people who have never met all independently fashion the exact same, uniquely complex key without any instruction.
The odds are astronomical.
The likelihood that all 5 widely dispersed daughter languages independently chose the base verb kвэл, when PIE had other verbs for turning, and then independently applied the exact same unique reduplication pattern, the same zero grade, and the same ending. It's just statistically and structurally impossible. That word kʷekʷlos had to have been coined once in the common ancestor language after the invention of the wheel, and then inherited.
Okay, so what about the second scenario the Anatolian camp proposed? Undetected borrowing. The idea that these 5 wheel words were borrowed widely across Eurasia after 3500 BCE, but the borrowing was somehow masked so perfectly that we can't detect it.
This is also statistically untenable. The comparative method is designed specifically to detect ancient borrowings, even if they happened a long, long time ago, by analyzing sound changes. Every language undergoes its own idiosyncratic regular sound changes over time. When a word is borrowed, it usually enters the new language, and then it's subjected to that language's sound changes.
So if it was borrowed, we should be able to see slight irregularities that would flag it as an outsider word, a linguistic accent almost.
We should. The idea that 5 quite different words, all borrowed from some unknown source, could have been absorbed into dozens of branches over 2 millennia and still look like they've undergone every single one of the idiosyncratic sound laws of each, i.e. daughter language. I mean, to masquerade as perfectly inherited vocabulary, it just defies all known linguistic probabilities.
So the wheel lexicon is an insurmountable obstacle for any date before 4000 BCE.
It is.
And the Anatolian branch itself, which is missing a lot of this wheel vocabulary, that actually supports the later Kurgan timeline, because it must have split off before that technology became culturally central.
That's the ultimate confirmation. The fact that the earliest split branch, Anatolian, lacks this technology lexicon, but the common ancestor of all the other branches has it, that fixes the date of PIE proper much closer to the 5th millennium BCE, and it completely excludes the 7000 BCE Neolithic expansion date.
And if we needed any more confirmation, the genetics field has weighed in powerfully on this, and it seems to have sided pretty definitively with the steppe.
Oh, absolutely. Recent genetic studies using ancient DNA analysis have now provided overwhelming evidence of massive migrations from the Pontic-Caspian Steppe into Europe, starting around 3000 BCE and then later into South Asia.
Which directly correlates with the Yamnaya expansion described in the Kurgan model.
A direct correlation. The genetic data largely falsifies the peaceful farmer demic diffusion model of the Anatolian hypothesis. It really makes the Kurgan model the undisputed frontrunner, based on chronology, on population movement, and on the linguistics.
So, with the Kurgan, or steppe hypothesis, established as the most plausible one, we now have to face its biggest socio-historical challenge: explaining the mechanism of spread. I mean, the steppe pastoralists were highly mobile, sure, but they were numerically small compared to the established non-Indo-European farming communities they were encountering all across Europe and Asia.
Exactly. We can't assume a simple military conquest because there were no Bronze Age empires capable of enforcing language shift over such a vast area. And the traditional model of demic diffusion, where one population just outbreeds and displaces the locals, that doesn't apply either.
So we need a more nuanced sociolinguistic model.
Yeah.
Something that explains how these IE languages supplanted established non-IE languages in a, what did you call it, A patchy, opportunistic way.
That's the key. It requires things like prestige, economic incentives, and social structures that are designed to integrate outsiders without needing mass population replacement.
We're looking for the engine of language shift.
And the PIE social structure, which we can reconstruct from its lexicon, provides these powerful mechanisms for recruiting outsiders and assigning prestige. The whole structure demonstrates a clear adaptation to high mobility and maintaining social life at a distance, which is crucial for pastoralists.
Okay, let's start with the role of prestige and patrons. What does the vocabulary tell us about their hierarchy?
The language confirms a strong social stratification. We can reconstruct words for wealth or possessions, like hirap, which shows up in the Hittite word for rich and the Latin word for wealth, opos.
So they had a concept of rich and poor.
Clearly. They also had words for servant and to lack, which proves that the society recognized these sharp divisions of wealth and poverty.
And how did these powerful patrons secure and advertise their status?
Through the feasting culture. Public feasting, the word is darum, a meal, was absolutely central to their political economy. The host of the feast was known as the hostipotis, which literally means the lord of guests.
So by being generous and hosting these big public events, patrons advertised their status and secured political support.
They gained leos, which means fame or glory, and this was often eternalized through praise poetry. The reconstructed word is hello, a song of praise, which would proclaim their gifts and cement their support base.
So if you were a non-IE speaker living nearby, adopting the language of the court or of the powerful patron offered a path to vertical mobility, access to wealth, and inclusion in this whole prestige economy.
That's it. You could become a client, a sok.
A follower.
A follower, yes. You would contribute animals to the chief's feast or offering. The chief would then ceremonially accept your offering using the verb de, to accept ritually. The entire framework provided compelling social and economic benefits. It wasn't about the sheer number of IE speakers, it was about the quality of their social network. The IE language became the language of opportunity.
That system describes the vertical structure. But the sources also emphasize another institution that was vital for this mobile life, the guest-host institution. This seems to be the horizontal structure that allowed the whole system to function over great distances.
The costas relationship was a vital adaptation. It was a reciprocal, mutual obligation between people who were not kin, even strangers.
And in a highly mobile, dispersed society like the Yamnaya, where you might travel vast distances away from your own clan, you'd need a mechanism to establish protection and trust instantly.
That's why it was so important. The host offered protection and hospitality, and the guest was obligated to return the favor later.
So it was essentially an ancient passport and social security system rolled into one. Why was this relationship better than local kinship ties for integrating new people?
Because local kinship is, by definition, geographically limited. The hostess relationship allowed social life to be maintained at enormous distances. It diffused potential hostility between strangers you might meet on the frontier. And critically, it could be extended to incorporate non-IE speaking outsiders. It provided them with clearly defined, reliable rights and protections under this IE social umbrella.
Which would incentivize them to integrate into the IE linguistic community.
A powerful incentive.
So that covers the incentives, but the spread of PIE wasn't always peaceful. The sources also point to a coercive mechanism running alongside this patronage system, the warband.
Yes, the warband, or choreos, was a much more coercive structure. Through comparative mythology and ritual, we can reconstruct that PIE youths were initiated into these Roman warbands. And these bands were typically associated with wild animals, wolves, or dogs. And they were often described as being violent, thieving, and operating on the social and geographical frontiers, basically terrorizing settled communities.
And we actually have chilling archaeological confirmation of these specific rituals, don't we?
We do. The site of Krasnosemersko in the Middle Volga steppes, linked to the Srebnaya culture, provided evidence that's perfectly consistent with these traditions. Excavations there revealed the remains of a midwinter ritual.
What did they find?
They found the sacrifice and consumption of at least 51 logs and 7 wolves. And this practice aligns perfectly with the mythological accounts of youthful IE warbands wearing animal skins and associating themselves, metaphorically, with wolves and dogs. It's a clear example of linguistic reconstruction being mirrored by hard archaeological reality.
So you have this high-stakes scenario. If you were a settled farmer in Neolithic Europe who didn't speak an IE language, you were either unprotected and vulnerable to the violence of these nomadic bands.
Or you sought protection from an IE-speaking patron.
Right.
And it's this combination of coercion and legal remedy that drove the shift. The threat of violence compelled people to seek protection and, crucially, to demand restitution.
And PIE had words for that too.
It had two distinct verbs for making restitution, including circ, which means to make restitution, to compensate, a word which survives in Hittite. The key insight here is that the IE language became the language of the justice system, the language of the high court.
So if you wanted compensation for damage or protection from the Koreos, you had to engage with the system in the language of the patrons who held all the power.
Which offered a powerful and very pragmatic reason for non-speakers to adopt PIE all across Europe and Asia.
When these IE languages expanded, they were supplanting established, often successful, non-IE languages. And as you said, the violence of the warband and the appeal of the patron system created these zones of language shift. So when one language replaces another, it never just disappears completely, does it? It leaves behind a linguistic footprint, a substratum.
Understanding the dynamics of language contact is essential for historical reconstruction. When languages meet, linguists categorize the resulting influence into different strata.
So let's elaborate on substratum.
A substratum is the local language that influences the intrusive, replacing language. It happens when speakers of a language, let's call it language A, abandon it in favor of an intrusive language. B, maybe because of political or economic pressure. As that population shifts its speech, it transfers loanwords, place names, or, most commonly, phonetic and grammatical patterns from their dying language A onto the rising language B.
So the DNA of the old language survives in the new one. The classic example is Gaulish influencing Latin as it evolved into French.
That's the perfect example. Gaulish was supplanted by vulgar Latin, but French picked up Gaulish vocabulary for specific things like barrels. And even some phonetic patterns in French, the way certain sounds are pronounced, are thought to be the result of Gaulish speakers imposing their oral habits onto Latin as they learned it imperfectly.
And what about superstratum? Is that the opposite?
It's the opposite dynamic. The superstratum is the intrusive language that influences the base language, but the base language persists. This is common when a small elite invades a large territory, but eventually adopts the local language.
Like Norman French in England.
Exactly. Norman French, the language of the elite rulers after 1066, acted as a superstratum over English. It contributed thousands of high-prestige loanwords like justice and parliament, which dramatically enriched the English lexicon. But English itself survived as the base language.
And the last one is adstratum.
Adstratum just describes mutual influence between languages of equal standing, like neighboring groups borrowing back and forth. Old Norse and Old English had an adstratal relationship in early England, which led to core borrowings, like the pronouns they, them, and theirs, moving from Old Norse into English.
Okay, so focusing back on PIE, the steppe dispersal means that IE languages supplanted countless, mostly undocumented, non-IE languages across Europe and Asia. How do we hunt for these unattested substrates if we don't have any records of the original languages?
Since we can't just read a dictionary of the native languages of Neolithic Europe, we have to look for two kinds of indirect evidence. First, the substrate words.
Words within the early Indo-European languages that just don't have a clear Indo-European etymology or structure.
Right, they look foreign.
And what categories of words are most likely to be borrowed from the people who are already living there?
Linguists search for words that refer to the unique local environment. For instance, indigenous fauna and flora.
Makes sense. The incoming PIE speakers would have needed local names for local species.
In Germanic languages, for example, we look at terms for specific native trees or maritime and fishing terminology that might not have existed in the steppe homeland, or terms related to early, specialized agricultural practices specific to Central Europe. The existence of the postulated Northwest Bloc substrate suggests that a non-IE language left its mark on early Germanic and Italic languages, particularly in terms related to farming and place names. And the second thing we look for is the patchy survival of non-IE language islands into antiquity.
What do you mean by islands?
The survival of languages like Etruscan in Italy, or Iberian in Spain, or various non-IE languages in the Mediterranean region long after the IE influx. This strongly supports the Kurgan model of patchy, opportunistic spread.
Because a uniform wave of advance model, like the Anatolian theory proposed, would have wiped those languages out completely and uniformly.
Which it clearly did not do.
Finally, let's circle back to where we started with Reconstruction, the computational challenge. How do we, as historical detectives, make sure we aren't confusing a deep genetic connection with just, geographical contact?
This is the persistent challenge of geographic convergence versus deep roots. We have to constantly test whether a shared feature is due to common ancestry, a deep root, or just later contact, which is convergence. The computational models struggle with this because geographical proximity can easily lead to late-stage convergence in phonology and grammar. It's that wave model effect again, and it can easily mask the deeper genetic branching.
So superficial similarities from being neighbors might mistakenly group languages together, hiding their true ancient separation.
Precisely. But there are crucial linguistic signals that can transcend geography.
Like what?
Consider the link between Tocharian, which was spoken in Western China, and Italo-Celtic, spoken in Western Europe. These two branches are geographically about as distant as you can get.
Right.
Yet they share strong, complex morphological features that are very rare elsewhere in the Indo-European family. Things like certain endings in their verbal conjugations.
A deep structural connection across thousands of miles.
That kind of deep structural similarity between geographically distant branches is the strongest possible evidence of a deep genetic root that must have occurred very early in the PIE split, probably before the major dispersal event. It demonstrates that the deep, inherited connections, the tree model, are ultimately more reliable than later, superficial similarities caused by contact and convergence, the wave model.
This entire deep dive has been a massive journey. We've traced a language community from its origins to its conquest of continents. We've reconstructed a ghost language using sound laws. We've used a Bronze Age wagon wheel as a definitive timestamp.
And we've discovered that the spread of this language was driven by a complex, high-stakes system of patronage and social power.
And the evidence converges dramatically on the Eurasian steppes.
It does. The chronological window is fixed, the demographic movements are now confirmed by genetics, and the socio-historical engine, the one revolving around prestige, mobility, and the threat of the warband. It explains precisely how a small but powerful pastoralist culture could drive widespread, opportunistic language shift across vast agricultural territories, and in doing so create the most dominant language family in world history.
The 6,000-year road trip of Proto-Indo-European reveals that the languages shaping our modern identity are not isolated branches at all. They echo the deep shared reality of a mobile, stratified, and fiercely competitive ancient social world that originated in the Pontic-Caspian Steppes. Their deepest shared reality lies not just in their words for family, but in the echoes of a powerful, organized, and often a very violent ancient social system.